that was entertaining. Obviously, you shouldn't do any of the stuff that I told you to do in my last video. That was an April Fool's joke. I got a lot of people with that. I thought I would come back and explain a few things about why some of that is stuff you shouldn't do. It won't be as funny as the April Fool's prank, but yeah, I probably owe it to the community, given the number of messages I've received from people who are saying, wait, are you sure that's right? Or maybe they didn't quite get that it was an April Fool's joke. So I thought I would explain in reverse why it's a bad idea to do the stuff that I did in the April Fool's joke, and maybe you'll learn something. To introduce myself, my name is Dan Garfield. I am the Chief Open Source Officer and co-founder of CodeFresh. I am an Argo maintainer. Cheers. And I'm also an Open GitOps co-creator and co-chair. So, luckily, I still have up the window that I used to use this, so I can actually fully just do this all in reverse. So, obviously, downloading a bash script or downloading any kind of script on container start is a bad idea. I've actually seen this at a number of companies. I've actually seen quite a few companies that will download a WAR file. I've also seen a lot of open source community images that do this. So for example, Kubernetes versions of images for community stuff where there are lots of updates. They don't want to update the images, so they just throw the update and they have it automatically download the latest version on start. Generally a bad idea. I get why some people in the open source community do it, but it's generally a bad idea because A, your container start time is going to be bad, but it also makes it really hard to reverse changes. You can't just roll back an image because the previous version of the image would just download the same thing again. So that's obviously a bad idea, and you wouldn't want to do that. You really want your container to be immutable. I said in my last video you wanted it to be mutable. Immutable means that it's unchanging. You don't write over it. Once it's created, it's static and it stays that way. And that just brings predictability to your software delivery. So let's get rid of that and go back to where we were. Oh yeah, putting everything in a make file. Why is this a bad idea? Why would it be a bad idea to use a make file? Make files are great. What I did here was I got rid of all of the layers. I said, I don't want to have any layers in my Docker image. I just want 2 layers. I want as few layers as possible. That's a bad idea. You want layers in your Docker image. You don't necessarily need infinite layers, but the reason that layers exist is they are basically changes to your file system that can be cached. When it comes to your builds or pulling in binaries or whatever, if different layers can be cached, that's going to speed up your build process, and so you're going to have a better CI/CD motion, quicker time to get those builds done. So you actually want to have layers executing things because generally it makes caching work better with Docker by default. All right, so the next thing that I had done after getting rid of all that stuff was to get rid of the multi-stage build. Multi-stage build, I said, I want that mono. I want that mono build. Give me that mono. What you really want, you do want multi-stage builds with Docker. Why do you want your Docker file to be multi-stage? Well, when you build software, you need some software like a compiler. So if you're using Go, if you're using Java, you need a lot more tools to build software than you actually need to run that software. So multi-stage lets you set up a temporary container basically where all of your build tools will live, and you can build everything, and then you make a new container that's very lightweight. You just copy all the stuff that you need to actually run your service into that new image, and that leaves your final image very small. And so that's a really big improvement. Multi-stage is something that I've seen really just not used nearly as much as it should be. In the community, in the open source world, I see a lot of people building binaries locally. They use make files, they build their binary, and then they have a Docker file where it basically will just copy in the binary they're built. And I see a ton of open source repos like this. I also see this in a lot of companies where they don't use multi-stage Docker builds because they will build their binary separately, test it, and then load it into a Docker image. Generally, you probably want to be doing your builds inside of a Docker image because it's going to give you very consistent builds. You know exactly what's in it. You're building it in a containerized environment. There's going to be no crosstalk. There's nothing coming in from your local file system or whatever. It's only the stuff that's supposed to be there. It's very repeatable. So you really want to use multi-stage Docker builds. A lot of companies don't, a lot of teams don't, and a lot of open source projects don't because they build the binaries separately. And that's been a very common pattern because most people that are using Docker images are sort of migrating from running these binaries in VMs or running these binaries in other situations. I realize that there are some projects where you're distributing the binary for people to install on their computer, so the image isn't necessarily the primary target. But if a Docker image, if a container is your primary target, you really should be doing this in a multi-stage Docker build. One stage to build your stuff, copy your stuff to the final stage, and you can have as many stages as you want. You can have multiple stages in a container in a Docker file. So that's why you want those to be there. The next thing, I got rid of the label maintainer codefresh.io. That's because I didn't want anyone to associate the atrocity that I was about to commit on this image with CodeFresh, of course, the company I love and co-founded. The other thing that I did is I replaced the image with this Cat the Hacker Ubuntu image rather than just the Golang image and Golang's a specific version. Now, why did I do that? Well, or what's funny about that? This is a little bit of an extra inside joke. I don't know if people will care about this that much. Ubuntu's awesome, right? I love Ubuntu. I run Ubuntu servers. I've used Ubuntu for years. Oftentimes when I see Ubuntu in Docker files, it means that people didn't necessarily optimize their Docker file because they just grabbed something simple. They knew it was going to work. Throw Ubuntu on there. And that's fine, but you probably have stuff on that Docker image that you don't actually need to run your service. And anytime you have something on your Docker image that's not needed to run the image, then you probably should remove it. So Ubuntu is a little bit of a joke in and of itself when it comes to containerization. The other thing that I did is I used the latest tag, right? Don't use the latest tag. Why? Because your builds are not predictable. It means that every time you build your Docker file, you might actually get a different result because it's building off of the latest version of whatever thing, whatever image you're relying on as the base. So you don't want to use that. You want to use a specific version. And I think it's fine to use point versions. Like in this case, I was using Golang 1.20, which would have point releases and have security updates and stuff like that. Maybe that's a little bit controversial, but I don't mind that kind of point update that includes security changes in my Docker images, and I can always go back and change to a specific point version if I need to replicate a build or something. In general, I think it's important to version those. Using the latest is a bad idea because, again, you can't have predictability in your builds. This Cat the Hacker, I don't mean to pick on Cat the Hacker at all. This is maybe a little bit of a very inside joke for me personally as a CodeFresh as a CodeFresh chief open source officer. So, Cat the Hacker, I don't know this person personally, but they put together this Docker image. It's a real Docker image. It's a Docker image that basically contains all of the tooling for GitHub Actions. And this is a little bit of a joke for me because, one, at CodeFresh, we make CI/CD pipelines, which is a competitor to GitHub Actions. GitHub Actions is also a partner, so you can integrate GitHub Actions with our GitOps dashboards, and you can get your CI/CD results there as well. So we're frenemies. That's very common in the industry. And differently architecturally, GitHub Actions decided that they were going to use micro VMs for the basis of their CI/CD. So when you actually fire up a GitHub action, it boots up a VM that's about 60 gigs. And this is something that most people don't know and they wouldn't have any experience with, because if you're just using it on the cloud, you wouldn't care that that's happening. And if you're using it, the only reason that I know about it is because when I was building some demos with GitHub Actions to show off our integration with CodeFresh and our GitOps tooling, our Argo tooling, I needed to run GitHub Actions locally to test it. I thought it would be really convenient. And there's some really great tooling that's been put together to do that called Act. And Act allows you to run actions locally, but a lot of the tooling that you want to use, you might need specific versions or specific images for, because the default image that matches GitHub Actions is like 60 gigs. And so if you need to, most of the time you don't need that extra tooling. If you do, then you have to specify this image when you're building GitHub Actions locally. So that's why I know about it. Now this is very different from CodeFresh, and I'm sort of thumbing my nose at GitHub a little bit here, because CodeFresh does containerized builds, so every step actually executes in its own container. So when you're building a pipeline, you say, run this container that just has this tooling, execute this, run this container that just has this tooling, execute this. Now you could actually pull in this, like an image like this, as long as your pipeline has enough memory, you could actually pull in the GitHub Actions image and execute, you know, everything that you would do in a GitHub action in that way. Less efficient from a caching perspective. Volume management is something that's a little bit more tricky. You have to mount external volumes and upload and download artifacts, whereas with CodeFresh, basically you get a volume that's attached to all of the containers, so anything you write is going to be saved. Just a little tongue-in-cheek, obviously, you know, if you love GitHub Actions and you want to use it with CodeFresh, you totally can. There's an integration there. We're frenemies, so we can poke fun at each other a little bit. Yeah, this brings us back to the original state of the Docker file. So for most of you, you probably already knew all this stuff, but just in case you watched my April Fool's video and you didn't get the joke, or you were wondering why I was telling people to do such terrible ideas, this video will actually explain, hopefully, how maybe you should be doing your Docker files. And look at this, we're using Alpine latest. Even the original version of this still has some stuff that maybe I would do differently. All right, with that, thanks so much. If you want to learn more about how to deliver software effectively, we have an amazing course, our GitOps certification with Argo. You can find it at learning.codefresh.io. And we have an amazing course on GitOps fundamentals and GitOps at scale. And you can bundle those together and you can do those. And we have probably over 20,000 students now. It's the most popular, fastest growing GitOps certification in the world today. And that's a huge, huge, you know, thank you to the community for doing that. The other thing I would mention is check out CodeFresh. You can build your software using our amazing CI/CD tooling. You can monitor it using our GitOps tooling. We have fantastic integrations. It's really great for working with Kubernetes, especially cloud-native workflows. If you're working with Terraform, if you're working with VMs, we've got you covered. So check out codefresh.io. And in the meantime, thanks for checking out the video. Take care.